You're listening to Boomers Today with your host, Frank Sampson.
Well, welcome to Boomers Today. I'm your host, Frank Sampson. Of course, each week we bring you important and very useful information on issues facing baby boomers, their parents, and other loved ones. And I want to thank everybody for joining us as I do each and every week. So many of you have shared our podcasts, individual podcasts, or the entire show with friends and family, and I can't thank you enough. I know that some of you go to our website at boomerstodayradio.com. Many of you listen to it on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spreaker, Stitcher, iHeartRadio, a lot of different ways to listen to it. And I know why we're getting so many listeners and why you're sharing these podcasts with others is because we got great guests. And I'm not going to disappoint you today. We have with us Patti Temple Rocks, who's an author, speaker, business leader, mentor, and storyteller. After a career in marketing and communication, she became an author and of her first book, I'm Not Done. It's Time to Talk About Ageism in the Workplace. It was ranked one of the 9 books every professional should read in 2019 by Inc. Magazine. Her work has been featured in Fast Company, Forbes, The Wall Street Journal, Inc. Magazine, CEO World, Market Watch, AARP Magazine, Chicago Tribune Syndicate, WTTW News Broadcast, and a whole lot of podcasts. So, Patti, thank you so much for joining us on Boomers Today. I really appreciate it.
Well, thank you for inviting me to be on.
No, it's great to have you. It's in ageism. We're going to talk a lot more about that today. It's an issue, a big issue in our world, but we'll talk about it. But I like to just start out. I mean, I've written a book and a lot went into it, and I had my own reasons for wanting to write it. I'd love to hear more about your book and kind of the catalyst, your catalyst of wanting to write it.
Yeah, well, I think, I was like a lot of career people and, happily moving through my career, seeing all sorts of great opportunities and things come my way, completely oblivious that there was this ugly thing ahead called ageism. And I just started to notice it happening to people around me, and most specifically to, a woman who was my, boss, mentor, had become a friend and was sort of at the top of her game and was sidelined. I watched it happening. I didn't understand it. I had a chance to speak to our CEO who had put her in her job and was a big fan of hers, I thought, and asked him, what was happening? Why do I see her being kind of marginalized like this? And he said, first he said, this could be good for me, which really fried me, because I don't think any of us ever want to feel like we get an opportunity because someone is being harmed. But then secondly, he said the words, I think she's just really tired. She's been here for over 40 years. Well, I know this person. It might have worked if I didn't know her, because you could imagine that could be true after working, for a really long time, but she wasn't tired in any way, shape, or form, nor was she ready to go. And that's when I just thought, there's something else going on. And it didn't take me long to figure out it was ageism. And once I figured that out, I started noticing it happening to other places. I became somewhat obsessed with wanting to make sure that it wasn't going to happen to me. And so I started, thinking about what I was going to do for a second act and, being ready for the time to come when I was, it was like a fait accompli in my mind, going to be sidelined. And then when it did kind of happen to me, I just thought, this is insane. Like I'm not ready for second act. I'm in my first act. I'm in the prime of my first act. I'm good at what I do. Why would I want to sort of move into this, lesser than role? And that's when I left. And I suddenly knew exactly what I was going to do next. And that was write and talk about ageism, because I think it is the most widely experienced or witnessed form of discrimination in the workplace and the least reported. So I knew that there was this gap of like helping people understand that's an issue, taking it, from not being talked about to making it something that people were talking about. And I just thought a good way to start that was to write a book and talk to more people about it. And I quite grandiosely say, I didn't want to just write a book. I wanted to start a movement. And I don't know if I would say that we're exactly in a movement, but I do feel like since I wrote my first book and then, did a second edition of it this past fall, there's a lot more conversation around ageism. So it still exists. It's still a big problem, but I do think more and more people are talking about it, which is only a good thing. Only a good thing.
So going into the writing the book, obviously you experienced it yourself, of others. Did you learn a lot from that book? Well, let me put it this way. I'm sure you learned, but was there anything that really surprised you when you were writing the book?
I think what surprised me and made me sad at the same time was how many people that I talked to had just been feeling it, but were either, I use the word shame. It's almost like they felt like I must have done something wrong, or I wasn't vibrant enough, or there was just this sense of like a shame. And the other word that surprised me that I heard over and over and over again was invisible. I felt invisible. I no longer felt seen at work. And I mean, that actually makes my heart hurt right now, all these years later, thinking about it, because that's just a terrible way to feel, and I know, that I think is something that is not exclusive to ageism in the workplace. I think that's something that happens to people as we get older. Sometimes we literally aren't seen, by the doctor who talks to the caregiver instead of, so that was, I would say, a big surprise to me, like how kind of personal it was. I focused a lot on trying to make the business case, because my sort of mission in writing the book was older workers are not the people who need to change. It's the workplace, that they need to get rid of these unspoken biases, create policies that are welcome to older people. So I was really, wanting to kind of focus on what the workplace needed to do. So I was very factual. I had statistics that showed how much it could cost a business if they, didn't deal with ageism in the right way, how smart it would be to hire, so-called older workers because of their higher engagement, and, kind of all of these practical reasons, because I was hoping to influence business, that I felt like I didn't give enough heed to sort of the emotional pain that is inflicted on people as they get older in the workplace.
So what would you say to people who haven't gone through it yet, but may, how to prepare for it? I mean, what to expect?
Yeah, I think that there's a couple of different ways I'd like to answer your question, but one is, if you are soon to be in the crosshairs, potentially, like what you really want to do is just start paying attention to all of the signs, subtle and otherwise, so that you might understand, is this, what is the history of this workplace? One of the things that I personally did after I saw this sort of happening is I thought back on all of the retirements, so-called happy retirements I had been part of as a 30-something or 40-something, and I realized I don't think those were all happy. I think there were many of those people were not necessarily retiring by choice at that point in time. So, I would just try to get a sense of, like, on a scale of, 1 being terrible, 10 being great, like, where might this workplace be? What is their history all about? I also tell people, just start talking about it. Like, start asking, like, talking about your 5-year, in the next 5 years, I'd like to do this. Like, don't let anybody assume, one of the things that was said to me when I turned down this job that felt very much like being set aside or marginalized was, well, how much longer do you want to work anyway? But it was said in a way that was not, hey, let's talk about this. Like, do you have a end in mind? Like, do you think you want to work for the next 3 years, 5 years, 10 years? We need to workplaces are still so uncomfortable having that conversation that I think we need to be prepared to initiate it ourselves at some point, just so that you're not sort of living with this, when is this, big surprise going to come down on either them or me. So, and the other second way that I would answer that question is, even if you're not going to be in the immediate crosshairs of this, you can be an ally. You still want to work in a place. And, I did learn this in my research. If a 30-something is watching a 50-something or a 60-something colleague be marginalized, they're going to think less of the workplace. It's going to erode some trust. And so, there may be I'm glad I'm not there yet because this isn't happening to me. But what you've done is you've just made them doubt the work, whether they can actually trust their employer to treat all employees fairly. So, I think that having allies and, we are in a place in history that we've never been at before, where there can be like 6 generations in the workplace, and we all need to kind of work together. And, the most optimistic that I felt in a long time was when I was interviewed by a couple of grad students who were, doing a project on ageism in the workplace, and they got good and mad. And they were, I gave them an assignment to go home. It was right around the holidays, and to talk to their relatives about whether they had ever felt marginalized in the workplace or whether they were worried about it. And, they came back to me after their winter break and said, yes, every one of us has somebody in our class had somebody in the family. And that's not fair. That's crazy. My Aunt Susan is still so vibrant and wants to keep working, or my Uncle Harold, so they were just really in it, and I thought to have 20-somethings feel that way gave me great hope and optimism for the future.
What advice do you have for those listening on the employer side? All right. You touched on it. You said, hey, we should be sitting down, having discussions, but let's say they're trying to plan for the future. And what if that person that is aging,
Right.
and let's say they've had great skills, but maybe the skills that they now need, whether they're from a technological standpoint or whatever, that they are really looking someone with other type skills, but trying to maneuver this in a way that it works out for everybody. But what suggestion would you give to employers on how to handle that type of a situation?
Well, I think, the most obvious answer for me is training, and there are, it's almost like the training opportunities, and a lot has changed. There was no COVID when I wrote my first edition. And so, people were still going to, a week-long seminar to learn new skills and places. Now, all of those things, and workers of a certain age were never sent to those things. And the employer would have the rationale, well, their time for us to kind of get our money back from sending those to their training is more limited. And so it was always a bad decision. But now it doesn't need to be as expensive to do some of that training. And so I would say to employers, don't ever stop offering the training. The other thing that I would tell employers is I'm starting to see cropping up these multi-generational employee resource groups, where they used to be, for women or for minorities or different things. But now, one started, I'm proud to say, because of my book called Sages. And it's literally about bringing together the different generations in the workplace to help each other. And organically, they have created some, volunteer training for each other, to kind of help with the different things. Like everybody says I want to hire a digital native, which is really kind of code for younger. And what that means is I grew up with a phone in my hand. I know these, social media platforms are second nature to me because that's how I've learned to communicate and all the rest of that. That doesn't mean that somebody older can't learn to use it or won't learn to use it, but just potentially in a different way. And what I would say to employers is that non-digital native person who can be taught has also experienced way more disruption in the workplace. And so they're going to help manage these transitions for you with your target audiences and your customers better, because they've lived through a lot of these, types of disruptive environments in the workplace. So I just think it's like the employer should not short shrift all of the skills that come with decades in the workplace, even if that may mean perhaps some of the, technology skills are not as good as somebody else's. To the employee, I would say, however, like, just don't give them any excuses. Like, learn those skills. Even if you have to do it on your own, keep those skills fresh. But on the other hand, you're never going to be, I'm never going to be, for example, a coder, I'm no matter what, like there's certain things that we're never going to be, but I have other skills, many of which have come from the EQ that I've gained for 4+ decades in the workplace. I'm going to lead with those. I am not going to, go into an interview or a job performance review type of conversation and say, like, here's all the things I did to be like all of the, Gen Xers in the workplace. I'm going to say, this is what I'm really good at, what you need in the workplace, what you will benefit from because of my experience. So don't bury it. Like I always tell people, you don't have to put when you graduated from college in your resume, but that doesn't mean that you shouldn't put not every, but you shouldn't sort of categorize all of the skills that you've gained in those, 3, 4, 5 generations that you've been working. Don't hide it. So they don't, sometimes I think people bury that because they think it makes them look old and they're worried that then they won't get the opportunity. And I always say, don't bury it, just recast it a little bit.
Great. So Patti, we're going to take a real quick break just to recognize our sponsor. I promise I'll be back soon here. And then when we get back, I'd love for you to tell us, as our listeners, how they can get your book. And then I'd like to talk a little bit more about men versus women. Who's it affecting in the workplace? We'll talk more about that when we come back. All right.
Okay.
So do you know anybody who may be concerned about an older driver? Well, Senior Care Authority's Beyond Driving with Dignity program is a facilitated self-assessment program for older drivers. This program has been designed to serve as a vital tool to facilitate older drivers and their families as they make appropriate decisions regarding the future of one's safe driving career. If the individual is a safe driver, an advisor will provide him or her with strategies on how to remain a safe driver as they progress through the aging process. If driving retirement is the appropriate decision, then the individual and their family are offered possible alternatives, resources, and a specific plan to ensure a smooth and successful transition from the driver's seat to the passenger seat. So to learn more, go to www.beyonddrivingwithdignity.com, or you can call 877-907-8841 to connect with a Senior Care Authority advisor in your area. Here we're back with Patti Temple Rocks, who's the author of I'm Not Done. It's time to talk about ageism in the workplace. So Patti, tell us how people can get the book and who's kind of your target. Probably a lot of people, but go ahead. I'll let you share.
Sure. Well, it's on Amazon, and I will also use this moment to sort of say, get my second book. It's called I'm Still Not Done. And I wrote this book just this past fall because I felt there were just some, new things that needed to be said about it, largely due to the pandemic and some changes, in our whole workplace culture as a result of that. Older workers were disproportionately affected, especially at the beginning. But another sort of, you alluded to this before the break, issue that I wanted to address was gendered ageism. And I quite purposefully, when I wrote my first book, did not address it. And when I say purposefully, it's because, it is a fact that regardless of your gender, your sexual preference, your race, your religion, we all get older. And so ageism is the only ism that I think affects everybody. So my feeling was we don't need to sort of slice it up to talk about it because it really will affect us all. But I got a lot of feedback after my first book from women basically saying, come on, you know it's worse for us. You need to address that. You need to talk about it. And my instinct had always been, yeah, I do think it's a little bit worse for women. But I did some research and found out that it actually is worse for women. And a lot of that has to do with, and I'm just launching into this part, so I hope that's okay. But a lot of that has to do with another ism, and that is lookism. And that has, long been more of a factor for women who just are judged more on how they look in the workplace. Attractive women get more jobs than non-attractive women. And it's just, and so how we age has become a factor. You better color your hair. I guarantee you most of your female listeners might have been told that, or if they weren't explicitly told that, they thought this is maybe something that I need to do to protect, and some of it. And I have no problem with coloring hair. Anybody should color their hair if they want to. But if they're doing it because they're worried about their job security if they don't, that bothers me, and that's a problem. So there are differences. Women also are much more likely to be the caregiver at home. So during the pandemic, women dropped out of the workforce at much higher rates. And one of the dirty little secrets about ageism at work is when you have dropped out by choice for a while and you come back to our previous conversation about, skills and experiences, that's a gap. And so while you're trying to kind of fill that gap, you're also getting older and then, might be short some of those skills and an older worker, and, the target is on your back all the more for those reasons. So I just wanted to address that.
Well, it's an interesting point where you talked about those in the workplace that may have dropped out because they're caring for a loved one. And there's all sorts of statistics on that. It was studies done by Harvard Business School, AARP. They came up with the same results that basically said, hey, companies, you better wake up because, you might be providing some benefits to your employees as it relates to childcare. But, absenteeism is on the rise, presenteeism is on the rise because of, care for a loved one at home, or even long distance caregiving where they can't concentrate and all that. Did you, in your book or in your future book, do you get into that at all? Because it's huge.
Yeah, no, I didn't.
Yeah.
Well, I did in that I talked about, the culture and sort of the unconscious or unspoken ways that it's practiced. And somebody that I interviewed tells the story about how this flexibility, which again, the way that we're talking about flexibility today is very different than we were, even 4 years ago. But flexibility was something that she felt was very much available if you were like a young parent trying to, raise your young children, and, they come home, they get sent home from daycare and, all these other things. She said, I felt like when I asked my boss for time off because I needed to take my mom to, doctor's appointments or things like that, I felt judged or I didn't feel as comfortable doing that. If the culture was in this particular work environment, probably 80% of the employees were of that age group where they had younger children. And so it was just sort of this accepted, part of reality. We're going to all have to cover for each other, but it should be no different. It's the same thing.
I agree with you. It is the same thing. And, it's near and dear to my heart. I kind of have told you what I do in my day-to-day work. And we do a lot of work for companies around the country with just that, and helping them come up with programs and benefits and educating people in the workplace regarding that. So they don't have to leave their job or they don't have to take off as much time. They know who they could turn to for help to help them in those types of situations. But that's all. We could probably do a whole nother session on that, but it's a big deal.
For sure. And it reminds me of the point that I made earlier, which I think is worth reinforcing a little bit. And that is that the culture of a workplace is becoming more important by the day. People are, whether it's remote work policies or different things, like people are judging whether they're happy in their job by so many more factors today than money. And one of those factors is the perceived and real treatment of employees. So doing right by your employees is not just helping that one employee, it's helping to send a message to the rest of your employees. And those messages, by the way, also get transmitted to your customers, your clients, and they react positively to that, oh, this is a good place to work. It must be a good place to do business with.
Yeah, 100% agree with you there. So we just have a couple minutes left. Maybe you could talk about some of the steps to ensure that I guess you call the age-gnostic workplace. So maybe we could talk about that with the time we have left.
Sure. And this was, more geared obviously to the people that can control what the workplace is like. But, one of the first things that I encourage people to do is to take an employee census and to just sort of understand, are you, as you know better than most, we are living longer. We are having expenses longer. We are needing to work longer. Does your workplace, your workforce mirror the population at large? And probably not, because most people are discovering that, they have very few workers over 50. So once you know that, you can set forth a conscious effort to try to do something about that. Make sure that when you're recruiting people, that you're making it clear that employers or employees of all ages are welcome to apply. Do training for your people to make sure that there isn't like implicit bias creeping in as they're doing these interviews. Be open-minded to hiring for a skill set versus just an age or a price. It can be as, simple too as looking at the external messages that you send people. Is your website showing only young, shiny faces, or do you show a representative workforce that includes older workers as much as younger workers? And, these employee resource groups, I think, are an incredible place to drive change. Just bringing the generations together to work with each other and talk to each other about the issues that they're facing will lead to positive change. And, you got to walk the talk. You can't just talk these days about, everybody's talking about DE&I, but far too often, DE&I does not include age, so make sure your policies include older workers, and ageism is something that you're protecting against, but don't just put it in your policy, bring your policy to life.
Great. Patti, thank you so much. We didn't say, you have a website you'd like to share with people as well?
Yeah. Yep. It's just Patti Temple Rocks, Patti with an I, templerocks.com. And I try to, you can find a link to buying my book there. And I post all of my recent interviews and podcasts and things like that, as well as some other content.
Great. Thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure. Thanks again for having me.
Good luck with your new book as well.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody, for joining us on Boomers Today. Please be safe. We'll talk to everybody next week.
You've been listening to Boomers Today with Frank Sampson. To learn more about today's show, visit boomerstodayradio.com and join us next time for another edition of Boomers Today.